Welcome. My name is Bradley Flam. I'm the director of the Office of Sustainability, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this third presentation in our Fall 2020 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. We are very happy to be able to co-sponsor this series with our colleagues in the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs and in the Office of Digital Learning and Innovation. Did I get that right, Kristen? Kristen works in the, what is the acronym now?
I believe we're calling ourselves the ODLI, the O-D-L-I. Terrible acronym.
We're very happy you're joining us today. Please remember that every lunch hour on Wednesday through November 18th, we will be having presentations from some of our colleagues at Westchester University, faculty and staff, as well as some invited guests. Next week, we will be having Professor Tina Chiarelli-Helminiak from Graduate Social Work, and I think you'll find that her presentation, like today's, is going to be a fascinating one. So thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to pass the floor to our speaker, Matt McMahon.
All right, hello. For those who don't know me, I'm Matt McMahon. I'm an assistant professor here in the econ department. I'm, I guess, in my third year now. I do a lot of environmental economics, so this is really kind of a natural fit. So let me go ahead and get this pulled up, and we'll start. All right, there we go. Can you see the full screen version of this? Awesome. All right, so so title there, Second Best Prioritization of Environmental Cleanups. This was actually just recently published in journal Environmental and Resource Economics. It's joint work with Jake LaRiviere, who spends his time everywhere working partially as a behavioral economist at Microsoft, as well as teaching at University of Washington and University of Tennessee, as well as with Justin Rausch, who's assistant professor at Xavier University in Cincinnati. And so, as you might guess by the title, if you're familiar with environmental cleanups at all, we're going to be talking mostly about Superfund sites. So there is some overlap here between Superfund and brownfield with what we're talking about if you're familiar with that, but just kind of in your head, think Superfund sites. And so if you're not familiar with Superfund sites, let's go ahead and talk about what those are. So basically, you can think of Superfund sites as kind of these post-industrial plant kind of like waste sites. There's something wrong in the soil or the water or something there that's kind of a byproduct of the former usually industrial function. And so it could be improper management, dumping. There's always kind of something behind it. But I want to kind of highlight that this does not include sites that pose an immediate risk to people nearby. Right? So we're thinking, you can't redevelop the land, but it's not exactly seeping out into the water table nearby or something. And with these sites, basically they're clean. The cleaning is mandated to be done by the EPA, and then they help develop the site afterward. And the funding for the cleaning and the planning and the development largely comes from litigation against those who dirtied the site. I say the site, maybe that's phrased poorly, because it's not that you dirtied this site, now you have to pay to clean it up. It's really just that there's one big pot, and funding for all of these sites kind of goes into that one big pot, and then the cleanup comes out of it. So it's kind of just this rolling fund, if you will. So some examples of sites that just kind of around here. The Philadelphia Navy Yard was a Superfund site. Havertown PCP site, the Roebling Steel in Florence, New Jersey, which is right across the Delaware, about maybe halfway up from between Philadelphia and Trenton. So there's a lot. Here's some kind of pictures. So let me scroll through. There we go. So here's the before and after of Girard Point in the Navy Yard. So you can see it's basically a landfill on the left there with just stuff everywhere kind of falling out into the river. And afterward, they've kind of cleaned it up and made it, actually useful. In Arizona. So here's a picture from Apache Powder site out in Arizona. You can see there's just tires everywhere, and then they've kind of revamped it into solar plants, among other things. It's a pretty big site. There's one from Massachusetts. So you can kind of see that there's a lot of cleanup that goes on, as well as the redevelopment process. There's kind of the two parts. And so this remediation includes completing full economic development of the site. And I really want to kind of highlight that before they can put the shovel into the ground to even begin cleaning up, there has to already be a full remediation plan completed, right? So they have to have everything completely planned out ahead of time. And of course, the remediation in turn helps local economies. So kind of the first to show this was a paper by Hamilton and Viscusi from 1999 in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. Basically, they're looking at home prices, and we'll talk more about what these benefits are soon. And when the EPA is looking at this, right, they have this rolling fund, we're going to find that they have not enough funds to clean up every site, immediately, right? So sites kind of get delayed. And so they have to figure out which sites they're going to clean up. And so they're charged with 9 total criteria that they can use to figure out which sites they want to clean next. But these are not based on any sort of economic factors. And so this motivates our research questions. And first, is the EPA essentially leaving money on the table by not considering economic factors when they're prioritizing cleanup sites? In other words, could we do better? Right? Could society benefit from the EPA considering some sort of economic factors when they're prioritizing cleanups? And kind of relatedly, well, okay, if that's the case, which as we'll see it is, how can they do it? What sort of policies should they be implementing in terms of prioritizing sites? And so that's what we're going to look at. So just a preview, we're going to start by modifying just a standard theoretical macro model. We're going to account for the local economic benefits of cleanup through some modifications, including both short and long run benefits, and we'll get specific about what those are in a moment. Then we'll use that model to run a Monte Carlo simulation. We'll calibrate it with actual data, and then we'll kind of test out different policies relative to the one we currently have. And kind of the point of the theoretical model is that it identifies which sorts of economic factors are going to play a role in terms of impacting social welfare. And then the simulation in turn is going to show the benefits of all these different various prioritization policies that we come up with, again, relative to the current system. And so the results that we find, we kind of come up with a set of guidelines that are kind of rules of thumb, ordered heuristics that we suggest the EPA should look at. So basically, kind of think of these as kind of rank order, with each subsequent one being kind of a tiebreaker for the previous. They should be looking at the smallest cleanup costs, the sites that have the most productivity lost due to the site being covered in waste and unusable. Third, sites that are in local economies that are currently in a recession. And last, sites that have the local kind of largest discount rates, where discount rate is essentially a measure of how much people in that economy value $1 today versus $1 tomorrow. And we're basically just going to use kind of municipal bond yields as kind of a proxy for that. And so I want to note, even in this preview, I think it's important to note that these heuristics kind of measuring at least 3 of these 4 things, maybe the second not quite as much, but the EPA already collects data on cleanup costs. Measures 3 and 4 are very easy and essentially costless to collect. And the second one really isn't that hard either, we don't think. And so if it's costless to implement and the benefits are large, then by not doing so, we're saying that the EPA is leaving money on the table. In other words, it's free money, free kind of welfare for people that should be taken advantage of. All right, so a bit of background. So before Superfund, kind of what led to the creation of it, you're familiar with the environmental history here in the US in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There were a ton of environmental disasters that got a lot of national attention. It was kind of constantly talked about. The Cuyahoga River fires, I think it caught on fire 13 times in its history. That's right, like rivers catching on fire, clearly an issue. The Valley of the Drums in Western Kentucky, the Love Canal was really kind of the main impetus, when sludge was coming out of faucets in Niagara Falls. President Nixon ended up creating the EPA through an executive order that he signed on December 12, 1970, but Superfund still didn't start for another 10 years. So here are pictures, Cuyahoga River fire, Valley of the Drums, so on. So Superfund itself was established through CERCLA, an act passed by Congress in 1980. Basically, it provides the EPA with the federal authority and resources to kind of secure these sites and clean them and so on. After the first couple of years, it was found that there was kind of a lot of friendly sort of handshake, under the table sort of stuff going on, and so they kind of they ended up passing a second act, SARA, in 1986, that kind of boosted, kind of bolstered the program. So minimum cleanup requirements, things have to be made public, and this is the part that mandates the post cleanup commercial and public use redevelopment, right? So you have to put that plan into place before you can even start cleaning up, which again is pretty key. And there have been some other minor modifications over the years that play into things in other ways, and not all minor, I guess, but minor relative to what we're doing today. So let's skip over those. So when we think about the Superfund's budget, because this is going to come into play, we're going to be talking about trade-offs, and so budget is naturally going to be kind of centerpiece there. The funding for basically kind of the entirety of the Superfund program comes from legal payments required by polluters. So it was originally started with kind of I think $7 billion setup by the federal government, but since then they put in regulations on polluters. It originally came from taxes on polluters, and that changed in the 90s, and now it basically comes from ex post legal battles. So essentially, after a site is left dirty and full of waste, the EPA goes in and takes the polluters to court, where they settle out of court, whatever, and they end up getting some money out of it. That just goes into the pot. But this funding is not site specific, right? It just goes into one big pot. So that's kind of one of the key points, is that this funding is federal level funding that comes down almost like this manna from heaven, right? Drops down directly into the local economy. So from the perspective of the local economy, it's essentially kind of free money from the top down that's going to pay for the local contractors who clean up this site, which then kind of stays within that economy. And I should mention that we do test and find that most contractors are indeed local to the cleanup site. The expenditures, so that's kind of where the funding comes from. On the expenditures side, Superfund expenditures average about $2 billion per year since 2001, and that's relatively constant over time. So every year it's about $2 billion. There's not a lot of fluctuation. And this is spread out over about 300 sites that are ongoing in any given year, right? So the cleanup kind of takes a couple of years, site dependent, of course. And so what this kind of tells us, right, is that the funding is not large enough to clean every single site in a given year, right? They have to pick and choose which sites get cleaned now and which get pushed back. So there are currently 1,300 sites sitting on what's called the National Priorities List, which means that they've been assessed and they're kind of just waiting to kind of move into the cleanup phase. So that's basically the wait list, if you will. And so this funding scarcity implies that the EPA must choose how to prioritize sites, right? So one of the things I talk about in day one, maybe day two of my principles class, right? The scarcity of resources implies trade-offs, right? We have to figure out which sites get money now and which ones don't. And so that's what we're going to look at kind of as kind of the key mechanism for how the policies that we propose could impact social welfare. So if we think about this remediation timeline, so if you're a site, kind of what is the process before you begin remediation? Well, first you have to be identified as a site. Second, sites that pose an immediate threat to human health, skip this list entirely. So we're not talking about those. You can just cross those out of your mind. Third, those that survive that get assigned a hazard score by the EPA from somewhere between 0 and 100. And if they score above some threshold, they're placed on this wait list, the National Priorities List, or NPL. Then from the NPL, the EPA uses 9 criteria to decide which sites they want to start working on. And critically, none of these 9 criteria include any sort of local economic conditions. So I do want to note that as far as we can tell, there are no laws preventing the EPA from using additional criteria. It's not like there's some specific formula that they have to follow. It just says, you must use these 9. But we test this. We test to basically see if there's correlation between the characteristics we identify and the timing, and we find that there's nothing there. So it doesn't look like they are using these. And there's precedent for that in terms of looking at kind of a racial social justice component, looking at there was in the first 15-ish years of the program a bias, kind of using that same methodology. Some people had found that there was like a racial bias towards white and higher income communities. So we kind of followed their methods, but looking at different variables. Speaking of existing literature, just to kind of briefly talk about what others have done. So as I've said, this Hamilton and Viscusi paper kind of started the whole thing. They find that there are lasting positive economic impacts. Kind of quantifying those, work in 2011 by Gamper Ravindran and some other people showed an increase 15.4% in the median home value near cleanup sites. In a specific case study by Gill and Zabel, they found that the total benefits, all these home price increases for this specific site totaled to roughly $72 to $112 million range. So, we're talking pretty large increases here. This is not chump change. And looking at kind of non-residential places, we've seen a similar impact on industrial properties. So Eilenfeld and Taylor found a similar one. Their 2004 Gene paper basically looked at this site in Fulton County. It's basically the same sort of story, but industrial surroundings. And there is evidence that this increase in property value directly correlates with site proximity, right? So the closer you are to the site, the larger an increase you have. So again, the same Gamper Ravindran paper, as well as some work by Ralph Mastromonaco. And then there's evidence that kind of the edge of this, that it just fully falls off after about 3 kilometers away from the edge of the site. So some work he's done with Chris Timmons. So you can basically, when we're talking about site remediation and how it impacts the economy, what you can think about in your head is kind of like a 3-kilometer ball, so kind of a ball around the site with a radius of 3 kilometers. And that's kind of the size of the local economy that we're talking about in this, right? And the kind of numbers you can put to it vary, obviously, depending on the current property values. But I think probably that, let me go back to slide 72 to $112 million range is probably about reasonable for any given site. All right, so let's talk through some of the methods, starting with our model here. So I won't get into too much of the technical details, but basically we're thinking we take this kind of standard, what we call a Ramsey model, to look at a small open economy. Again, small meaning 3-kilometer ball around the cleanup site, kind of standard continuous time framework. And the way the model works is essentially there's this central planner. You kind of think of maybe as the EPA in this scenario, who's balancing the local consumption and capital. And the planner's goal is basically maximize kind of social welfare, right? Overall social welfare, considering not just today's, but also looking forward, forever into the future. And this balance of consumption and capital, if you haven't had a lot of economics, basically what we mean is, okay, money can be spent on consumption, which are things we enjoy that make us better off, right now, versus capital, which is money that we're investing so that we can produce more in the future and consume more later. So it's the kind of the trade-off between how much we want to consume now versus how much we want to consume later. And that's kind of how we're splitting our money. So when you kind of solve out this standard model, you get this kind of typical Brownian motion framework. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry, but I know it is used in a lot of other disciplines, physics, whatever, chemistry. Kind of the main properties of it is that there's this kind of steady state. So the economy operates in some sort of steady state level of consumption and capital, which is called C star and K star. And so if we have like temporary one-time disruptions, so like a one-time sort of policy intervention that doesn't really change things in a meaningful way, yeah, it'll bump us up and down or whatever in terms of, how well off we are in a given moment. But it doesn't really deviate, it doesn't change the steady state itself. We end up converging back toward that same original path. However, we can have permanent changes, generally in terms of the productivity of the workforce, and this alters the steady state itself. So examples of this change could be things like, making property, more valuable, right? So completely, revamping the Philadelphia Navy Yard makes us more productive because now we can put in businesses and kind of develop that up and have this, great access to the subway line in Philly and all these other things. I guess subway line doesn't quite extend down that far, but close, almost. And so we're going to modify this standard model in 3 important ways. So the first is that we're going to model recessions. So we're going to model this as basically a negative shock to economic productivity. So the economy gets less productive. And then it's going to slowly get more and more productive back towards where it was. And so this graph here, probably, I guess, not maybe super important to understand, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. So on the horizontal axis, we have time. On the vertical axis, we have capital. And you can see, so that red line shows us K star, that's our steady state level. And it changes over time, right? As we start off, everything's normal. And then at time 20 there, we hit a recession. That steady state level of capital drops because we become less productive. And then it slowly increases over time as, we kind of go back towards normal. Our actual level of capital follows, it's always getting pulled toward that steady state, and that's what's shown in blue. So it starts to decay and then eventually starts to kind of catch back up and goes back towards that initial level. So modification number 1 is our recessions. And I guess the next one's just consumption version. It's kind of similar story. Modification number 2 of 3, we look at the short run effect of cleanups. So when we clean this site, as I mentioned before, this is federal money that's coming in directly to the local level. This is going out as contracts to local contractors for cleanup, for building the new buildings that are going to be on the site, whatever it is. So this direct injection of federal cash is a kind of a one-time boost. And we model this as an increase in capital because that's basically kind of, it's being spent not on consumption, but in terms of, basically investing in the local economy. So this is, again, quite literally the cost of cleaning up the site is equal to this one-time boost in capital. And so this is transitory or temporary. It does not affect our steady state. So yeah, it's nice we have this boost, but we're, if you're just dumping money in, it's kind of things are eventually going to return back towards where they were. Modification number 3 is the long run effect of cleanup. So this is the permanent boost in economic productivity that comes through via, increased property values and being able to have the Navy Yard in proximity to, Center City, whatever else. And so this in turn permanently alters the steady state. So if we look here again, time and capital, you can see that the red line showing the steady state of capital at time 20 when the cleanup occurs, boom, we have this jump. The steady state permanently changes. It goes up. And then the blue jumps up, the blue line shows the actual capital. That jump is the short run boost. And then it converges not back to the original steady state, but to that new steady state. And so that's kind of the mechanism or kind of the path that things take. So modification number 1, we showed just a recession with no cleanup, and we showed how that worked. Modifications 2 and 3 were the short run and long run impacts of cleanup. And this graph kind of shows how they work. And this graph is basically the same thing for consumption. So basically, we do all this, we solve all the math that goes with this, and this basically tells us, all right, what can we expect to see? What are the predictions that we would expect empirically? So by adding all 3 of these simultaneously, we can basically see what factors, economic factors impact social welfare. And so we get some predictions. Basically, prediction 1, and this is really almost common sense, but in the absence of any sort of funding constraints, it's always better to clean sites sooner. Obviously, of course, that's unrealistic, but it's important to consider as kind of a benchmark. Number 2, given a budget, smaller cleanup costs, so cleaning sites with smaller cleanup costs, in turn allows for more sites to be cleaned, which allows for kind of more increases in social welfare in terms of kind of fixing that long run issue, right? So you can kind of, the number of sites plays an important role here. Number 3, cleaning sites basically that are dirtier, that dampen productivity more, right? In turn, increase social welfare more, as we would guess. And I should say, I kind of misspoke. I wouldn't say necessarily dirtier. It could be that they're in a very prime location or, in whatever way they dampen economic productivity. More so, cleaning those increases social welfare more so. Number 4, cleaning sites where there's currently a local recession helps, right? Of course, by ending the recessions faster. This is essentially your typical counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy that we would teach in our Principles of Macro course. And number 5, cleaning sites and economies with higher discount rates increases social welfare more. So Again, this just comes back to places where they value a dollar today relative more than a dollar tomorrow, relatively higher, right? That ratio is higher. All right, so let's talk about what we did with the actual simulation. So the way that this works is, so it's called a Monte Carlo simulation. Essentially, we take 1,000 random draws, and each single random draw is going to be basically one scenario of reality, right? One basic kind of version of reality, right? And we do it 1,000 times, and then we kind of say, all right, well, what happens, and what is the average across these 1,000 different realities we've looked at? So within each draw or each reality, we generate data for 500 different cleanup sites, and we look at the impact spanning 60 quarters or 15 years. We have the budget that increases every quarter, every 4 quarters, every year. And again, budget, just like everything else here, is based on actual EPA data. And recessions can occur at any given point, any quarter, not just equally, and they occur stochastically or randomly. And these are based, we'll get there in a second, basically these Monte Carlo draws. Each time we make a draw, right, we're kind of modeling, all right, here's one possible instance of reality. There's variation in 4 different dimensions. One is the local economy's probability of entering a recession, which we call rho, Greek letter rho. The second is the local economy's discount rate, R. Third is the site cleanup costs, K bar. And fourth is the site's productivity dampening effects on the local economy, right, which is 1 minus A of W. So A of W is kind of where you're at. 1 is the cleaned version, right? So once it's cleaned, where you're at, and it's like, all right, how far off of the clean version are we? And so what we do is we go through and we take tons of actual data from, say, Bloomberg data on municipal bond ratings, and we take data on when locations have been in recessions or not. We take EPA data on cleanup costs, all sorts of stuff. And with each of these, we build a distribution of kind of what each of these variables looks like. And then as we kind of create one sort of reality, one draw from this Monte Carlo simulation, it just kind of picks at random based on each of those distributions, and that gives us our reality. And then we compare 8 different cleanup policies for each different Monte Carlo draw for each reality. So our policies, first we have so number 0, kind of our baseline. This is essentially sites are cleaned randomly. So this is basically the status quo policy. Of course, they're not cleaned randomly. Reality, they have those 9 criteria, but they're random with respect to economic variables. So they're essentially random from our point of view. And then the 7 policies that we kind of come up with relative to that. First policy, we look at just cleaning sites and recessions first, but otherwise random. And then policies 2, 3, 4, and 5 just basically take the same 4 variables that I've mentioned a few times, and we say, all right, what happens if we order our cleanups based on those? Policy 6 ranks sites by the largest expected net present value of utility per dollar spent. In other words, what is, in terms of bang for my buck, discounting back how much I value it today if it's happening in the future in expectation, where is the best place to spend my money? Where can I plausibly expect to be the best site to spend my money? And this is, of course, the ideal situation, right, in terms of things that are feasible. This is exactly how the central planner would generally be thinking about it in a classical economic model. And number 7, remove the budget constraint, clean all sites immediately. This is really just a, unrealistic benchmark. And so the way that the simulation works, once we have this kind of initial setup of sites that we've drawn from a single draw of the Monte Carlo simulation, so we have these 500 sites, 4 parameters are drawn for each site. And this gives us like at time t equals 1, here's our starting setup. And then for a given policy, in time 1, we rank all 500 sites according to that policy. We go through that list of 500 sites and in order, and if we can afford to clean up a given site, we clean it up, and that site's cost of cleanup is removed from the budget. And then we move on to the next one with the remaining budget. But if we can't afford it, then we just leave it uncleaned for now. Quarters 2 through 4 are just natural kind of progressions. We follow through the model. Recessions may or may not happen in accordance with kind of random draws that I described earlier. And then as we hit Q5, beginning of the next year, boom, new budget again. And with that new budget, again, we re-rank all the sites according to that policy. We go through them all in order again, clean up the ones that we can afford to clean up. And this repeats throughout 60 quarters, 15 years. And at the end of all of that, we calculate, all right, what was the utility gain? What is the total utility from each site in each given quarter, discounted back in time to today? What is today's actual, what is kind of the end result? What is today's total social welfare, total utility or happiness across all of this? So we look at, say, how much does society get out of this policy? And then we compare each of those policies back relative to our baseline policy. And then once we've done that, for each Monte Carlo draw, we're looking at, all right, for each policy, we've done it 1,000 different realities. What is the average change in average percent change in this overall measure of social welfare? So that's a lot. I know if you're not familiar with simulations, hopefully I didn't lose you in there, but that's kind of the mechanics of how it all works. So now let's get to the fun part, results. So we'll go in reverse order a little bit. Policy 7. So policy 7, as a reminder, is cleaning all sites immediately. So we just entirely remove budget constraints. This is like our dream world, right? And we find that social welfare increases by an average of 4.18% relative to our current status quo policy. And this is highly statistically significant. Of course, it's not realistically feasible. It sucks, but it serves as kind of an upper bound benchmark for other policies. So that 4.18% is kind of our better than best case, our unrealistic best case scenario. All right, policy 6. So again, this is prioritizing sites by highest expected net present value. So this is kind of your if we could really order things the way that we want to, as best we possibly could, this is how we would do it. This is the ideal realistic policy. We find that across our 1,000 draws of the simulation, there's an average increase in social welfare of 1.88% relative to the status quo policy. Again, highly statistically significant. So this is really cool. This is kind of our rough estimation, the EPA really could feasibly come up with a rough estimation of these sorts of numbers. They could implement this sort of policy. However, doing so would be costly. This is not something that would be, you can't just Google it and find the data on this. You have to really crunch the numbers yourself, probably they would have to hire, a couple of staff economists to kind of routinely do this. And so our model, of course, ignores these administrative costs. And so, yeah, we see there's a benefit, but we can't definitively say, this 1.88 is a great number, but that's kind of upper bound because there's some costs involved too, right? And we're, of course, realistic about that. Policies 1 through 5, the last ones here, this table kind of shows the mean percent increase, that's the same statistic we've been looking at relative to our baseline or status quo policy. So kind of take these in order here. So just cleaning recessed, so sites that are in recessed localities first, mean increase of 0.3%. So if you recall our last slide, our best feasible realistic policy was like 1.88%. This is an order of magnitude lower, right? But it's still pretty good, 0.3%. And it's very easy to tell which sites are in recessed localities. You can, there's data on that from the Federal Reserve that anyone has access to. Second one, highest probability of recession. We find a mean is actually a decrease here, but it's not statistically significant. The p-values, 0.5. So really, we find that this doesn't do any good. So knowing the site is likely to go into recession doesn't really help. Once it's in recession, that actually makes a difference. So we can kind of cross number 2 off our list of possible policy guidelines. Number 3, discount rate. Again, ordering these by largest discount rate. So mean increase of 0.21%. So it's roughly the same magnitude as policy 1, a little bit lower, but not too far off. Smallest cleanup cost, mean increase of 1.85%. So when we ran these and first looked at the results, that's the one that really stood out to us. because this is an extremely feasible policy. The EPA literally already has all this data. They know how much it's going to cost to clean up each and every site. If they just use that criteria as a ranking, then boom, that's a 1.85% increase in welfare, right, on average. And then fifth, I mean, that's what, 0.03 percentage points off from what we saw in our best case feasible, but with basically no administrative costs. So that's really cool. And policy 5 is the long run damages from waste. Again, so back down to 0.37%, so still a pretty meaningful increase, closer to the realm of policies 1 and 3 as far as kind of the order of magnitude of the effect it has. And it probably has, it's the only one that really might have some actual administrative cost to gathering data of these 5. And so the EPA could implement these policies pretty nearly costlessly. But of course, our simulation is not going to be perfect. We understand there's some caveats, that it's, it kind of is what it is. And so instead of just kind of taking these numbers at full face value, we kind of turn them into these orders of magnitude sort of ballpark sort of deals. We take this kind of rule of thumb approach. And so what we recommend, rather than saying, we expect it to be this percent increase if you do this, basically these sort of ordered heuristics. So starting with the most important, kind of using each subsequent one as a tiebreaker while relevant. So starting first, you want to prioritize sites with the smallest cleanup cost. So again, this is an order of magnitude effect larger than the other 3. But then you kind of tiebreaker to that, the largest amount of long run damage caused by the waste. Next up is sites that are in economies that are in recessions. And last, looking at ordering by local discount rates. So kind of a summary of what we've done here. The EPA doesn't consider economic characteristics when prioritizing sites, but there's a large literature showing that there's benefits. So that implies, maybe they should. Let's explore it. So we model the local economic impact of site cleanup, including both short-run benefits, this kind of manna from heaven money being injected from the federal government straight down into local contractors' pockets that then circulates around the local economy, as well as the long-run benefits of, all right, now we have land that we can use and be productive with. And we use this model to kind of set up these Monte Carlo simulations, which in turn show that the types of prioritization that we can look at, we actually see improvements in welfare. And so we use these to provide a set of guidelines for the EPA to follow. And these guidelines are nearly costless to implement. And so really by ignoring them, the EPA is essentially leaving money on the table, right? There's no reason to leave it. It's just sitting there. You might as well grab it. I'm thinking about where things could go. So as I mentioned, this paper was just recently published, and we're looking to extend this. We have kind of a handful of thoughts. We want to look at maybe correlations among some of these characteristics we've considered. Are sites in recessed economies also more likely to have, larger cleanups or something like that? There might be something to that. We could also consider other potential characteristics, extending the model in other ways. Perhaps the length of time that it takes to clean sites matters in some way. Or maybe there's some sort of geographical and spatial complementarity between sites. So 2 sites being close to each other, maybe cleaning them both, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So adding some sort of spatial component could really kind of enrich, the sorts of policy that we could recommend. We could also think about things like maybe site contractors responding to local economic conditions. If jobs are scarce in a recession, maybe contractors are going to work extra hard under those circumstances to try and, make sure that they're the ones who win future contracts as well. Something like that. It would also be helpful to allow the social planner, the EPA in this case, to bank funds across time, or kind of thinking of that in reverse, to potentially kind of borrow from their future self, if you will. As far as we could tell, obviously we're not legal experts, as far as we could tell, there's no real clear legal answer to whether this would be allowed, but it would be interesting, we could do that sort of thing in a theoretical model and see, how things would play out. We also, if the EPA decides to implement these guidelines, we would love to do an ex post analysis using the actual data to see kind of how close our simulations end up being to predicting what actually happened. I would love that, not just because I would love for my research to impact EPA policy, because that would be cool, but also it would be, kind of academically very interesting to see how well these predictions are. And if they do well, then, maybe this sort of simulation can take off. It's largely used in mostly macro sorts of fields right now, and there's maybe some crossover in environmental econ that's perhaps ignored. It would also be interesting to extend this to other types of federal spending that has kind of similar characteristics. You could think about transportation. So, federal money coming down to the state level. The first example you can think of, or that I think of at least, was in 2015, was it, when Obama had put aside all this money to build high-speed rail from Chicago to Milwaukee and in Florida and whatever, and the governors just flat out refused free money. And that's basically the same thing that's going on with this EPA sites, except that it's not being refused. I don't think they have the authority to refuse it. You could think about kind of, all right, what was the impact in refusing that money? We can model that perhaps using the same sorts of things we're seeing here. And you could also think about education, right, where you're choosing spatially where does this money go, but you're kind of temporally, kind of rigidly kind of fixed amounts of funding, right? So I think there's probably a lot of other applications where we could think about similar projects and could model them pretty similarly. So that's kind of where we're at with this, and kind of enjoyed doing that project, even if it was a bit outside of my wheelhouse as far as the macro stuff goes, but I really tended to enjoy it. So I'm glad you guys came to listen about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Do you want to stop sharing the screen so that those of us on the call can see each other with questions?
Yes, I'm happy to take any questions you've got. Perfect. Yeah.
So what avenues would you use in approaching the EPA? It's got a combination of lifelong civil servants and political appointees, so you have to navigate that, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that's an area in which I have very little experience. So my first thought would be to turn to my co-author, Jake, who has a lot more experience with that. But no, I think that's something that would be really nice. I think as an economist, a lot of times, outside of environmental econ, watching the news and the things that policymakers come up with, they clearly are not taking the advice of economists. So that's kind of a frustrating issue in a broad sense. This specifically, I don't know. Obviously, EPA funding is down right now. I don't know if the current administration would go for these sorts of projects, since funding's kind of been slashed a lot. If you're talking, our best case feasible policy, which requires increased funding, maybe hiring economists, I don't know if that would go over. But some of these costless things, I think could probably be done. I don't want to say with certainty, but I would imagine sort of an in-house sort of thing could be done that wouldn't need top-down, direction. So, that's a good question. Got suggestions? I'm all ears. or contacts. I'm also open to that.
Well, I wasn't clear which of your variables might have been taking into account the populations that are impacted by this site. And I know you said that they wouldn't, these aren't dangerous sites or anything, but was the actual number of people who are engaged or around this site part of the
That's a good question. So I should have maybe mentioned when we're looking at like the discussing these impacts, those figures you saw with capital and consumption changing, whatever, that was all normalized to per person. So that was all per capita. And where population growth is essentially netted out with like depreciation, blah, blah, blah. But kind of the upshot of all of that at the end of the day is, no, we did not take it into account. So I guess to the extent that it might that would correlate with the variables, that we do take into account, there might be something there, but that would be a pretty good extension. It makes the model a little bit hairier to consider that sort of thing, which is why we kind of stuck with our simplest 3 modifications. But that would actually be a good idea.
because if you're smack dab in the middle of Philly, rather than in
so I guess that would play in through the economic through the productivity lost due to the site being covered in waste, right? Because that's going to play into the property value. So it's not like a direct, it's not like we have that variable in there per se, but it is like, there is kind of a causal relationship to a variable that's in there, but controlling for that more directly would be really interesting. And certainly if we do like an ex post, like empirical analysis with actual data, if they implement this, then yeah, that's definitely something we'd want to look at.
Yeah, I did think of a possible avenue for context. I can't think of any specific names, but back in the 90s when I was at the University of Pennsylvania in graduate program in the same department as the master's program in environmental studies, there were some EPA Region 3 people from Philadelphia that were teaching, maybe one or more in that program. So might be worth reaching out to the office there in their environmental studies program at Penn and ask if anybody's still doing that. That would be somebody.
That's a good idea, because I would love for this to leave the ivory tower, so to speak, right, and actually reach, you know, the people that could benefit from it. Because it seems kind of, even if you just take like the smallest increase that we saw, it's like, just consider it. You don't even have to follow it perfectly. Just consider it. You're at least going to see some increase, right? You've already got the data for cleanup costs. Like, just go for it. So yeah, I would love for that. I'll check that out. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of questions. The first is, I wonder how reliably accurate cleanup cost estimations are, because in a lot of planning efforts, there's a lot of cost overruns that end up negatively impacting the plans that were put in place. So I'm curious about that. I'm also curious about the existing criteria, which you didn't go into a lot of detail, and wondering if the addition of these economic criteria might negatively impact some of the priorities reflected in those other criteria in a way that's not captured in productivity analysis.
Okay, so to your first point, that's a good point. We didn't, the data we used was actual cleanup cost, so we didn't use any sort of expected kind of initial expected cleanup costs. So that's a good point. It would be nice to compare those and see how well the EPA is estimating those things up front. Yeah, because that could lead to some sort of bias or things moving in the wrong direction potentially. To your second point, I've already forgotten it. I liked it.
Talking about the other criteria.
Oh, the other criteria. Yeah, so that's a good point. So part of what we did, so with those 9 criteria, we kind of tested, all right, they're presumably ranking based on those 9 criteria, right? And we tested to make sure they're not ranking based on R4. We also tested to make sure that R4 criteria don't correlate with those 9 to the best that we could, which I don't think I went over in there. Some of those measures we don't have really good measures for. Some of them, you know, we do. We couldn't find any sort of relationship. So to that end, from an economic standpoint, there shouldn't be, at least as far as, you know, economic values that we're capturing, there shouldn't be any impact that we're not, you know, kind of capturing. But, you know, that's using the measures we have, which are obviously imperfect. So I do think that would be a good idea to consider maybe in more detail if they decide to even, you know, consider doing this, implementing this sort of policy. I think they'd really need to sit down and look at, like, all right, well, what are the trade-offs from the environmental perspective, and how do those manifest themselves in economic costs, whatever other way. And it's also something we could look at if they implement it. We could kind of look at that from the back end using the actual data and see what those might have been. So if we could come up with specific concerns of you know, okay, now we're not looking at, you know, groundwater seepage or something, we could go and look and say, you know, all right, well, how has this impacted, you know, drinking water nearby, groundwater nearby, something like that. But it would definitely be, yeah, I agree that that'd be really important.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. I mean, EPA has traditionally put a very high value on human health and safety and ecosystem functionings and endangered species. And, you know, you have to wonder if some of those priorities might be negatively impacted by a larger focus on the economic and productivity.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because, yeah, I mean, we're not capturing, you know, say biodiversity in an area or ecosystem functioning or something like that. And so, yeah, it's, if you really want to do like a full, especially ex post kind of impact, looking at analysis of, what this policy actually does, that would be, yeah, really important. That's a good point.
We are at 12:50, a couple of minutes past, and traditionally at this point we say thank you because some people have to leave and get ready for another class. But we also ask if the speaker is willing to stay if there are additional questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you need to leave, please feel free to do so. But I know I have some more questions, and I'm assuming other people do too.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, Matt. That was great.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Matt, I was just on the Masters of Environmental Studies program website for UPenn, and my friend and former fellow graduate student Yvette Bordeaux stayed on, and she's still in charge of that. And I looked at the faculty bios, and there's a Joseph Lisa from EPA Region 3, who's the chief enforcement officer there. Apparently he teaches a class or so in there. I think he probably would be a very, I don't know him, but
Yeah.
he's got 1 foot in academia and 1 foot in government
That's
regulation.
fantastic.
And so he might be able to let you know who you might be able to talk to.
What was his name?
Joseph Lisa.
Ah, I see him. Yep. Got it pulled up here. That's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah,
And
sounds
talk
like a
to
really
Yvette.
good
She
fit.
might, well, I think maybe going directly to him would be all right. I was going to suggest talking to Yvette to ask who amongst all those people that they might have who's worth talking to, but he seems like the logical person.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll look at that. I need to talk with my coworkers anyway, or co-authors, sorry, and figure out where we're headed with follow-ups to this anyway. So I'll bring that up to them and see kind of their thoughts, because that would be cool to see something like this actually kind of take form.
Yeah.
Other questions? I know I'm curious about an early statement you made in your research question, in fact, of asking whether EPA is leaving dollars on the table. And I think I understand that what you mean is that those are dollars that would accrue to the local economy in terms of higher property values and other economic activity. So am I correct in understanding not
Maybe I should have said, leaving utility on the table or leaving social welfare on the table. Because I guess the idea is that the money's going to get spent anyway. It's just a matter of kind of where and when it gets spent, right?
Okay.
So we might as well, assuming that we're perfectly capturing everything, we might as well spend it in the way that improves, that maximizes our total social welfare. And so if we're spending in any sort of other way, then we're just basically leaving that welfare on the table, right? And assuming that it's costless to figure out which way, is the best way to spend it, of course, too. It's kind of a component of that. So it's not just the benefits of the cost side, but if it's costless to figure it out, and the benefits are, at that point, even if they're remotely positive, then and that's kind of where I was going for that, more so than money, I guess, leaving social welfare on the table.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. At one point, I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity to increase the amount of funding available for such cleanups, but that's not precisely where you were going with that.
Not where I was headed with that. Although I would be interested to see how that plays into it, right? So if you target certain cleanup sites or something, does that lead to, how does that impact future litigation, if at all?
Thank you for that comment, Terrence. Do you have any questions before you might have to log off?
No, I don't have any. I'm just kind of observing and taking it in. This is the first one I've attended, and I'm gonna sign up for a few more because it's pretty interesting.
Well, thank you. We're glad you came, and you came to an excellent example of the really interesting work that's being done. I do want to mention, I should have mentioned this earlier, but there's a link between your presentation, Matt, and the second to last presentation by Professor Mahboober Meenar from Rowan University. He's going to be talking about brownfield redevelopment and looking at it more from a community community development perspective. He's a GIS specialist and a geographer.
Oh, cool.
And I think some of the work he's done will have some interesting connections to what you've done.
I will be sure to, I plan on attending as many as I can, but I will definitely be sure to come to that. That sounds cool. I've wanted to get into kind of more spatial side of things because it plays into so many aspects of economics, but
well, you're in the right college at Westchester University.
I know, right? Very much so.
So Matt, I just want to say nice to sort of meet you.
Thank you.
I've
Nice to meet
been
you.
at the university for 21 years now. I'm the science and health librarian and involved in a lot of sustainability, environmental sort of
Cool.
things.
Nice. Well, it's nice to meet you as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw you at the Sustainability Council meeting. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, good.
Matt is our new chair of the newly established Sustainability Council Building and Energy Committee.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep.
Good deal.
Yeah. It's been fun. We kind of jumped straight. It was kind of weird starting something like that up this was in the middle of spring, like as everything was still crazy. But
yeah, we have not met in person and are unlikely to do so for a while.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go. Great to see you all. See you,
Great
Sarah.
to see
See you, Amy. See you, Brad. See you,
Thanks
Matt.
for coming, Walt. Yeah. Matt, thanks very much.
And-
all right. Yeah. Thank you all.
And I look forward to getting the recording and the slides for posting on Digital Commons, because I do that too. I'm the administrator of Digital Commons.
Nice.
I'll get them to you, Walt.
All right.
Okay. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Take care, guys.
See you. Thanks, Matt.
Bye.
Bye.